the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemist, the whole state of things, the pure violence without option anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our discussion, we briefly want to mention that we do have a Patreon account available that can be located at www.patreon.com/MUHH. We do have access to the Discord server available as part of becoming a patron. And then we have I think there's recorded material from several reading groups we've been doing that's available for, I think, everyone on the free tier. And then you'll also get access to my our show notes. So basically the sort of outline and text and all the kind of shit that I put together and sort of study and use to structure every episode as a PDF that'll be available once the episode is available on Patreon. Today we're having a look at Massimiliano Tomba's Marx's Temporalities. We're doing something more violent than even Deleuze's buggery. I don't think that Tomba would acknowledge these are like bastard children, more so than monstrous children. So forgive us. He's a nice old man. He's a kind old Marxist. So
is Tomba still kicking?
Yeah.
Did you
I believe
watch
so.
Did you watch some YouTube videos? Because you talk about him.
I did see at least one YouTube video. I want to say that Adam from Acid Horizon, I don't know if they had him on. I know Adam seemed to have familiarity with him. And he implied that they had a discussion of some type.
Yeah, I see. He's got the white hair and stuff. It looks like he's in his maybe mid-60s. So he's not as old as he could be. Right. I mean, we've had some guys in their 80s on the show, and they still knew a thing or two. So I guess my question to you, Coop, is almost like the origin story question. How'd you come across the work? What was it that inspired you to put it on the docket for today?
What I really wanted to do was to mine it for sort of the temporality angle, and I think it kind of didn't deliver exactly what I was hoping for, to be quite honest. But I think that what I've done is put together an episode that weaves in some of Tomba's work here in a way that I think is useful for the trajectory that we've been on in terms of the last several 5 to 7 episodes, roughly, working towards the manuscript. I mean, I think I've got a whole bibliography for us to work through for the next several months already laid out. But yeah, I was kind of hoping that this would yield a little bit more in terms of the temporality angle, which I'm not saying it was a bad book or anything like that. It wasn't exactly what I was wanting, I was looking for. Per se.
Yeah, I think that the type of temporality, for example, the one that I felt he was consistently weaving was the asymmetry between use value and exchange value, and that being read as a sign of a different type of temporality. If that were made more explicit, more clear in either the title or the opening preface, then this might have, do you think, been put on the back burner and something else taken its place?
I think so, for sure. I think Marx himself, or maybe it's Tomba himself, goes through like this idea. I think Marx's word is like work rung. I have to look it up. I have a glossary here, actually. Let's see if I can find it.
What, Wirkierung? Is that the word?
I think that's the one, yeah.
Which might be like realization or effectuation. I don't know German as well as I'm just thinking of Wirklichkeit is one of the words for reality or effect or actuality.
I think what he was saying was that the way that socially necessary labor ends up shaking out is that whether what was produced ends up having having value,
Mhm.
the worker's labor having actually produced value is a future anterior determination.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So one's labor and lifetime and labor power, etc., can retroactively be robbed of any value creation. I don't know if it's necessarily robbed, but it can be post hoc determined that the labor did not have value. It's like worker wrong or something like that was Marx's term. But I thought, thinking through Freud, Nachtraglichkeit, I've used Nachtraglichkeit
Here it is.
extensively.
Is the word Rückwirkung? That's
Yes,
the
that's it.
retroactive effect.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
See, yeah, that's right. I had forgotten about this. Yeah, the Ruk is the back. That's interesting. That term I should have noted down. I was in like pure read mode, but that's great that you bring up Nachtraglichkeit. So I'm gonna write that down just for my future anterior.
As an alleged Freudian, I should know better. Is Nachtraglichkeit a concept that Freud uses and refers and comes up with Nachtraglichkeit, or is Nachtraglichkeit a German word that he appropriates as part of a theory?
Lacan would call it a kind of quasi concept. Lacan would say he's the one that really highlights and lifts it up from Freud's text. That Freud is not necessarily explicitly conceptualizing that term, and Lacan turns it into a concept, or he that's what he claims of the après coup. The après couper, he wants to say he's the one that isolated it and really lifted it out and showed that it was like operating in Freud's text with a conceptual bent, whereas Freud may be doing it more unconsciously. Lacan says it explicitly somewhere. I'd have to go look, but he's like, I was the one that saw the Nachtraglichkeit, and it's like, were you really? But if so, I'll take you at your word. Two other things. One, it does seem like Tomba, just based on the titles of some of his other works, is fascinated with temporality in general. His book from last year is called Revolution and Restoration, the Politics of Anachronism. So that is kind of interesting that there's a theme in his work. I would say to the listener, just because we might be using him against the grain doesn't mean that we don't respect what he did. It's just we are coming to these texts. I think you made this explicit last episode, Coop, but the text we have set up for the following few episodes are we are coming at it against the grain or with an agenda in a good sense. We're sifting for the gold nuggets that can help guide us through a particular investigatory angle, which doesn't necessarily mean we're biased in a negative way, but that we're looking for a particular type of reagent, and some of them might fall through our sieve. If I kind of said that in a weird way, but that was how it came to my head.
Yeah, definitely not trying to work through the text in any kind of like pedagogical. I'm fucking that
Yeah,
up.
pedagogical. Yeah, I mean that's typical of how we normally read. Usually, it's just whatever catches our fancy, but this time we have a scent we are tracking.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I don't know if we're doing philosophy per se, but
It's in there.
maybe so. Something approaching like doing philosophy, perhaps.
It's a part of the mixture.
Provisionally. I'll be like Freud and say provisionally.
Yeah, it's a part of the mixture. And I would say to you, Coop, in terms of, because I read chapter 1 and chapter 3, which is the one we're going to focus on today. And in chapter 1, I was interested in his discussion of Bauer and Stirner, and this kind of notion of the French Revolution either smoothed over in a kind of conservative light of leading up to the Terror, which is a somewhat Hegelian reading of the French Revolution, and then these other means of reading the French Revolution as a break and a rupture. There's two temporal readings of the French Revolution, and whether or not it's kind of smoothed over and incorporated into this long and winding road of absolute spirit or whatever it might be, versus seeing in it a break, epistemic or otherwise. The one thing that I thought came out, well, two things. One, we are approaching this text with a specific point of view. So listeners, this is a great text for an overview of various concepts in Marx. Tomba is a very, he shows his work, I would say. So it has a lot of great sources to look through. We are looking at it from the angle of our own manuscript. And the second thing I thought was really great, I was not thinking about this, the term that he at least looks through of Marx's notion of retroaction, of Rückwirkung. And as I said, Wirklichkeit is one of the words for actuality. It might be in Hegel's The Real is the Actual quote. He might use Wirklichkeit, or in any case, you were likening that to Freud's Nachträglichkeit. I think Schrecky translates it as deferred action. In Lacan, he talks about it. He translates it into French as the après coup, right? The after the fact. That's a great point, and something that I flagged for the future, because citing Tomba, we could give him credit for any of that if we were to look at Freud and Marx in terms of retroactivity, deferred action, or you were talking about it in the sense of the future anterior.
One thing that kind of struck me when thinking about some of the stuff that Tomba brings up in the book, like socially necessary labor time, there was something that I didn't even really grasp quite, or like sort of a presupposition, is that Marx is doing economics and he's not doing economics. And I think this is a perhaps big area of misunderstanding, where even you hear today people, typically non-Marxists, of course, they're like, oh, his economics are bullshit, or like, right, they don't, as an economics, it doesn't work. But the thing is that it's sure,
these conservative
well, I mean,
commentators are a number of just different people that don't think Marx is a true economist or something.
I more so wanted to just draw the distinction between Marx not doing economics and Marx doing critical theory, as far as it's a critique of political economy. That's a subtle distinction, perhaps, for some who are not that well read in Marx, but I think that's an important one for maybe people who don't have as much, haven't invested as much in the Marx Capital reading specifically. I found myself benefiting from sort of understanding that distinction. You can profit by producing something that doesn't have any use value. And so there's a lot of stuff that feels a bit, I think, counterintuitive, or like it disproves Marx's theory, but it really doesn't, because Marx isn't doing a theory of economics. He's doing a critique of political economy.
I think that may be something that sticks in the craw of economics. People that want to do economics, they have to wade through Marx's philosophy. He's carrying out a critique. It literally, he's calling it a contribution to the critique of political economy, right? So he is, and it's very rich, right? One has to approach Marx as a philosopher, which doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't have a lot of important things to say that bear upon our understanding of economics, capital, all these other things. But I think that's the difficult part of Marx, right? Is appreciating the extent to which his philosophical underpinnings are informing his critique and his critical perspective.
For example, to the extent that Marx could be, if you're taking, I mean, this is obviously contested as far as whether Marx even holds any kind of labor theory of value. And I don't want to get into the minutia of that debate per se, but merely to point out that if he does hold some sort of labor theory of value, it doesn't have anything to do with price. And I think that's a common misconception. And I think that misconception is part of this trying to look at what Marx is doing as an economics, a theory of economics. And it's not, at least not directly the way that we might consider, I don't know. Like it certainly is a counterpoint to something like marginal utility, but I think it's doing something different regarding the political economy angle. While it does involve in economics, it's not economics, I think, as we might define it today or something. The discipline of economics as it exists today is something different than what Marx is doing. And so that either sort of anachronistic issue is what leads to a lot of confusion or dismissive approaches to Marx. But anyways, we're getting way into the weeds. Tomba's wager in the book here is that capital is not, capital being Marx's Capital, is not an autobiography of capital. It's this clash or a record of a clash between what he refers to as a tendency and a counter tendency, and this being written across multiple non-synchronous temporalities. What we're going to do is really push that wager through the working title of our manuscript, Chronos Unbound, towards a single thesis, with capital itself being the first mode of production without measure, meaning that it is a measureless metabolic operation consuming lifetime, both living and dead, and it runs this retroactive temporal logic that leaves the past unsettled, and it conceals the whole sacrifice behind the harmony of monetary equivalence. I literally mean sort of human sacrifice here, not just sacrifice as a sort of metaphor. It's the sacrificial knife. And this goes to my recurring thesis about all societies being primitive because they are predicated on human sacrifice. Now, whether that be literal, the killing of like children and sacrificing them on an altar, maybe, but maybe not quite so direct. Maybe like the amortization of sacrifice of a person's labor time and lifetime and like sort of their metabolism itself being metabolized and becoming capital and becoming the sort of the army of the dead that rules over the living. There's an unbinding of Chronos, the release of the apeiron from any, is it Pyros or Pyros?
Yeah, Paros, yeah. So the Paros being the limit, the apeiron being the unlimited, the indefinite, however you want to call it, Anaximander's term that gets taken up by Simondon and others.
The climax will be the foreclosed dead, the general intellect, which I think Marx refers to in like the Grundrisse, the general intellect. So I kind of like expand. I think Marx's use of dead labor, I expand to include the general intellect because I feel like it's more powerful that there's expenditure, whether it fits into some theory of value or not is irrelevant, but there is a use value to the general intellect that gets appropriated by capital, right? Mm-hmm. And I use the example of mathematics, but there's any number of things, simple things like fucking language, and like I liken them to technologies in a certain reading of technologies. I'm starting to conceive of debt as a temporal technology that capital employs. Not only capital, but certainly I think it's been part of exchange with it or economies always. I want to refer back to my good friend Count Orlok and his quote from Eggers' Nosferatu, "I am an appetite, nothing more." I also want to bracket the episode with the other. So we have the image of the vampire and we have the pencil from the I Pencil short story or whatever the fuck it is that Milton Friedman talks about. And
yes, that's right.
Marvels at the way that the coordination of the market and price signals and so forth are able to take all these heterogeneous components of knowledge and industry and weaves this very like elegant theodicy. You know what I mean? It's like a real theodicy in the way that the unity of price and exchange via price can coordinate what no individual possibly could. So we wind up with a cheap pencil, but that pencil there's no one person who is directing the production of the pencil. It's like a social process that is achieving the pencil. So in this picture, the vampire would be capital seen from inside its drive, and the pencil is capital seen from inside its self-justification, where Orlok is stripping the vampire to a pure metabolic function. There's no subject behind its consuming. There's no qualitative content, only an appetite, only a metabolism. So that's capital status in our frame here. It's not an agent with desires, but an appetite that has acquired social relations in order to route itself through. It's like the contagion that passes through bodies, so to speak, although that might not be super accurate, but just bear with me. So we have I Pencil, which is actually Leonard Read, who wrote this in like 1958, but popularized by Milton Friedman, which we can refer to as the hymn to the invisible hand of the market, the miracle that no one person, no one individual knows how to make a pencil. And we'll come back to the pencil at the end of the show to really show how this is a theodicy. What it tries to do is justify that this order is good, and it does so by hiding the sort of violence, the sort of sacrificial nature of extraction, of metabolism and time. And the thesis of the episode will be today that capital is the first economy with no external measure, and the whole apparatus of money exists to make that measurelessness look like a harmony, right? So it's an apparent harmony. The theodicy is an appearance. Did you have anything you wanted to step in with at that point?
I remember we talked about Friedman and the pencil. I don't remember exactly which episode, but a few episodes prior. That was a really nice, it's a theoretical anecdote or something, right?
I believe it was the Poststone episode, because
Okay, that makes sense.
There's two things, there's two sides of it, where it's abstract labor time and monetary exchange that are behind the coordination. Those two things are what allow the pencil to appear in this theodicy the way that Milton, or not Milton. Yeah, I guess he is Milton, like not John Milton, but Milton Friedman. First, you have to have an abstract equivalence for time, because you have to be able to universalize these different temporalities of different speeds of labor and production and work. There's a certain rhythm that, and this kind of goes to Tomba somewhat, right? There's certain rhythm of production that a lacquerer has versus a chemist and versus a miner, like a lumberjack or what have you, right? Like all of these different temporalities of production are all, first, there must be a universal time to allow this process, to allow these heterogeneous components to be able to synchronize production. And then you also have to have the monetary exchange as well, right? Because they're doing, I don't know if money would, I don't want to go so far as to say that money represents time. I think that could fuck up some of my philosophical commitments, but in a certain shorthand, there is some type of relationship between time and money as these universal equivalent, or these general equivalents. It gets philosophically a little bit muddied in terms of saying specifically that abstract labor, or what money is really abstract time or something like that. I don't know.
Right.
But I want to go back to our good friend Achilles, whom we discussed a bit in the same vein in the Richard Seaford episode, because before money universalizes equivalence, there's a consciousness that still has the ability to refuse it. And the figure that refuses this in Seaford's book is drawing from Iliad 9, the embassy scene that shows that pre-monetary moment, because we see Achilles presented with a catalog of compensation, tripods, gold, horses, women, cities, this whole apparatus of equivalence laid out as a sort of like a shopping list to sort of buy back his honor. but he refuses that offer. His reason being that the founding sentence of this entire episode, cattle and tripods can be raided and won again, but a man's life does not come back across the teeth once it is gone. The psyche does not return. That would be the inexchangeable name directly. Life is the one thing for which there is no equivalent, no buying back, no item on the list. Baudrillard talks about this. There's no exchange equivalence for death. So Achilles can still act on the refusal. He withdraws. He takes his lifetime off the field. But by segment 7 of the episode, we'll see that the same truth, the worker sees the same truth, but can't act on that because the equivalence has kind of closed over everything. And this episode is the slow foreclosure of Achilles' refusal. This is a kind of a shitty paraphrase of the kind of scene. Not all the wealth of Troy, nor all Apollo's threshold holds, is worth a man's life. Cattle and tripods can be won again, but the psyche does not come back once it crosses the teeth. And so that's kind of paraphrasing the Iliad, probably poorly, but you get the point. So I'm going to read a quote, and this is Marx quoted by Tomba, and it's from page 138. The prolongation of the working day behind the limits of the natural day into the night only acts as a palliative. It quenches only in a slight degree the vampire thirst for the living blood of labor. So this is precisely why the vampire is the right mascot. Orlok doesn't have a hunger the way a person does. He is hunger that has acquired a body. Same with capital. It doesn't have an accumulation imperative. It is the imperative that has acquired persons. It's acquired the whole social relation of production. This is the inversion Marx invokes when he says the means of production employ the worker. We develop it as a psychotic structure, so a foreclosure of the limit once we reach some discussion later on in the episode involving the working day. So there's two openings that rhyme in opposition. On one side, Achilles guards the inexchangeable life from the catalog. On the other side, Orlok is what arrives once the catalog has won and life is metabolized without any remainder. And the arc runs from one to the other.
I'm thinking how you're fitting together some of our previous discussions. At this point, looking forward to see how you're going to weave these in. I'm glad you brought up, obviously, Achilles and referenced the Seaford episode, which will obviously be out by the time this hits the platforms.
So the first segment in the episode, the first mode of production without measure. Here's a quote. This is from Tomba on page 139, and I think it's a footnote, but it's Tomba's formulation. It's not a direct Marx quote. Capital goes beyond any limit, presenting itself as the first mode of production without measure. Every prior mode of production carried measure inside it, subsistence being bounded by the household, tribute being bounded by what the feudal lord could extract, feudal production being bounded by ritual calendars and bodily recovery. But capital is the first mode with no external measure. Its limit is internal, dynamic, and self-generated. And I think, to me, this reminded me a bit of the way that Deleuze and Guattari discuss how capital sort of will set and approach internal limits and then sort of, right, there's the reterritorialization, deterritorialization thing. But it's always about negotiating these internal limits and what have you. And I think the dynamism is the dynamism and the self-generation are the two important things there. So not like a classical limit, it's a gradient that runs towards an asymptote. And the precise word here, measurelessness, so not unlimited, where measurelessness is an ontological condition, unlimited would be merely quantitative. So mapping this onto Seaford's puros apeiron, the Greek achievement being to bind unlimited substance, so apeiron with limit, puros, and that being through coinage, because coinage becomes the universal substance. Money being bounded that way by the sovereign stamp, by law, by religious sanction against unlimited accumulation. Unlimited accumulation, like in the sense of, this is the sort of logic behind the potlatch, where there's a check on the hoarding of wealth or the hoarding of goods or what have you. And that's the sort of function of the potlatch versus the unlimited accumulation of capital, right? Because I think the implication as well is that, like, going to my thesis about this whole sort of expansion of dead labor and the gift, I may have to just table that for a second, but I'm just thinking about capital kind of does a one-sided gift in a way, right? Like it kind of uses the general intellect, but it doesn't actually provide anything in exchange for that. That's kind of rough, but just thinking off the fly. Capital is what happens when the apeiron escapes its pyros, so its limit. This points to our title. Chronos unbound is the apeiron unbound, with time as the medium of its unbinding. And the vampire, just to be clear, is Marx's own image and not something that we're imposing here.
And Tomba brings it up pretty clearly. It's in chapter 8 of volume 1 of Capital that vampires and werewolves show up pretty clearly. You know, we can harken back to, was it Plateau 10, where it's dated, what, 1730, 1750? When
1725?
So, okay, something like that, right? Where all these vampire stories start creeping up.
So, for example, Capital doesn't register the 24-hour day as a hard limit. It treats the limit as a soft constraint that it can potentially work around. An intensifier, when you can no longer extend the work. Like there's a 24-hour limit in a certain way, but in a certain way, Capital, through its, let's say, its conquest of time, which Tomba historically, I think, definitively illustrates as like the Eiffel Tower being this way, I think in 1913 is the way that time gets compressed into a universal time, because it's no longer driven by the solar time where each city or what have you was kind of like relative to its position uses the sun as its own like local temporal guidance, where
Right.
now we have this ability through a centralized form of time, a conquest of time that enables us to kind of extend beyond the 24-hour day as a hard limit. I'll draw that out a bit further, I think, where it'll make a little bit more sense. I'm going to read Tomba from page 138. The vampire presses on, denying that it is impossible to make the workers work for more than 24 hours in a day, or intensify labor or increase productivity. Capital is psychotically structured in the strict Lacanian sense here, where psychosis is the foreclosure of the cut, the refusal to register the limit. Capital can't accept that the day has 24 hours, that the body needs sleep, that the Gemeinwesen has a finite reserve. Every encounter with the limit gets processed as a problem to intensify through, and never as an actual reality to acknowledge. This provides our bridge to Bataille, where capital is the first economy that refuses to expend its surplus. Goes back to what I was referring to with respect to the potlatch and the logic of the potlatch being to expend the surplus rather than to continue accumulating without a sort of release, right? Like edging forever. Every prior economy disposed of the accursed share through sacrifice, festival, war, gift. Capital reinvests instead of expending, and that's why it has no measure. The one mechanism that ever held measure, sovereign destruction of surplus, has been suppressed here. La part maudite, read forward, the unexpended surplus turns destructive in ways the economy can't control. What's registered there is the implication that the surplus, the accursed share, accumulates. Capital tries to invest the surplus, but it doesn't alleviate the need for expenditure of some type to occur. I've used this image in some discussions before with Hugh Taylor about the dairy cow, for example, right? We pump the dairy cow full of hormones that make the dairy cow's body react as though it were pregnant so that it produces milk. The dairy cow is kept in a constant state of like production, but in its quote unquote natural cycle, eventually the body of the cow they would give birth and there would be a rest period, right? There would be a recovery period. But instead, this hormone is injected, is we're continually edging the cow in terms of reproduction, but it's never reaching expenditure. But there's still a cost associated with that isn't registered on the books of capital. There's sort of a free rider, or there's something going on there relative to like the metabolism of the body of the cow and the metabolism of the body of the worker that are like, I'm just drawing, and I think it's an easy thing to show how the worker and the dairy cow share a certain like ontological relationship to extraction in this way. Segment 2, the word is Verzehren. So capital's metabolic ontology. I want to read from page 126. The means of production consuming the worker as the ferment of their own vital process. Tomba kind of allows us to slide Marx into this kind of Bataillean register through this etymology where consumption comes from consumptio, and this German word means devour, eat up, waste, consummate.
Apparently, in its reflexive form, verzehren means to languish. Etymologically, comes from to tear up, to consume, to tear to shreds. I think that's why he's highlighting the German here, right? Consume here also means to destroy, very much so, right?
So the worker isn't used as a mere input. The worker is metabolized, fermented out as the catalyst of capital's own vital process. So if you can think in terms of an image, yeast dying, but it produces the alcohol that capital drinks. The decisive refinement here is about the use value. Labor power's particular use value is bare embodied vitality. The flesh would be the fermentable substrate and not labor's productive contribution. And this would draw, at least from our perspective here, or my perspective, I don't know if Taylor will co-sign this, but this is closer to Simondon than most Marxisms, where labor power's use value is the metabolic capacity of the body, the pre-individual reservoir that capital's drawing on. The inversion is objectively real and not ideological. Marx is reflected in the consciousness of capitalists is not a misperception. The capitalist consciousness is actually accurate. The means of production really do employ the worker. Dead labor really does dominate living labor. And this draws us back to our Postonian point, which I may have to link the Postone episode so people can go back, where abstract domination is structurally real. The capitalist is correct in a way that makes the correctness, it's damning and it's not exculpatory. Our operator, the petit mort a, is already actually operating in Marx before Lacan or Bataille ever get added, where each cycle of consumption is a small death of corporeal vitality that circulates through valorization and an amortization of living time into accumulated value. So Marx is already writing with the operator, but we're actually going so far as to add and name it within our manuscript. I think this is the actual Marx quote. Capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks. This is what grounds the vampire in Marx intimately, and it provides a narrative glue for the episode. The vampire is not capital in general. It's specifically dead labor feeding on living labor. Orlok in the cold open isn't this loose metaphor. He is Marx's dead labor, and the appetite is the appetite of the dead for the living. We can track the figure as it deepens across 3 separate segments. One being the appetite, moving on to the metabolism, and then the full dead labor thesis that we're going to work to. One vampire that's illustrated in several stages. Quoting Tomba from page 126, the living corporeality to which that labor power is inevitably attached. Another quote from page 126, the dead dominate the living. This is where Orlok pays off. Under capital, appetite predicates flesh and not the other way around. And I think maybe you can check me, or I think this is kind of the notion in Marx's fragment on machines, and as well as Guattari, perhaps, in what's the machine and structure, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But it's sort of like I don't know if you want to maybe draw that out, because they sort of talk about, it just draws out this notion that the machinery is the sort of operative, like the machine is primary and the workers sort of are, I don't know if it's the machinic enslavement but there's sort of the bodies of the workers become sort of, I don't know how to characterize it per
Hmm.
se. But
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's kind of what the idea here in terms of what's the quote he used earlier was like the means of production employ the laborer or something like that and not the other way around.
yeah. So this quote is, if from the point of view of the labor process, the worker treats the means of production as the equipment for his productive activity from the point of view of the process of valorization, right? So from the point of view of exchange value production, it is, quote, now no longer the laborer that employs the means of production, but the means of production that employ the laborer. And that is, I assume, Capital Volume 1. It says 1962A, I'm guessing. I'd have to look at the bibliography. I'm guessing that's, or it could be Grunriese. Yeah, no, it's Capital Volume 1. In any case, yes, that's the difference that he's trying to constantly kind of suss out, is the asymmetry between production in terms of use value, which you can find in all previous societies, right? And then the production for the sheer means of valorization or production for exchange value, right? That's the capitalist mode specifically, and how you're correct in saying that it's the, now the laborers are merely adjoined to the machinery of production.
I think I kind of agree with Baudrillard here, though, as far as I think use value is sort of an alibi. This may be because I think the potlatch, for example, just illustrates that logic where what's the use value to the destroyed whatever, right? The
Mm-hmm.
property that gets destroyed. Like there's a kind of logical rhyme at play. I would say maybe provisionally that use value has always been an alibi,
Mm.
perhaps. Not everyone's gonna like that. Use value becomes this transcendental thing in that regard, right? Where I think that's problematic ultimately. If we could only return production to this original good way of producing that fills needs, but I don't know. It's like there's always been a surplus generated by
Yeah,
all societies, no matter how small,
yeah.
and use values exist. Certainly, we use things to reproduce, but like that being there being some like truth, some like presupposed truth of the use value, I find perhaps a bit problematic. What do you think?
Well, one thing
Or
I
is
would
that too
say,
much? Maybe
I mean,
that's
I think that Tomba is able to gloss this as well in his reading. One thing that I think, so you're not wrong in what you're saying, but I think the emphasis that Tomba wants to bring out through Marx is the fact that, for example, when he brings up Aristotle, Aristotle doesn't have the category that Marx sees as important for capitalist labor, because Aristotle is, for Marx, Marx is looking in terms of commodity production for the undifferentiated human labor. What is it that makes men free in capitalist production, right? So the laborers have been freed from their peasantry, but they're free labor. They're free for something far worse in Marx's mind, right? They're free in the sense in which they're free to sell their labor power. And Aristotle couldn't have conceived this in a time when slavery was a dominant mode of production. So there wasn't the quote unquote free laborer, either freed from slavery or free to sell their abstract labor power. Your use of the of Baudrillard's notion of the alibi, which is one of his, you could call it a concept or a quasi concept, because he sometimes uses it without calling attention to it, except it always strikes one as strange when he uses it. But you're right, there's something of an alibi, one could say, in use value. But it's a question, I suppose, that doesn't yet get us to the type of commodity production that Marx is analyzing in the sense of quote unquote equal human labor or undifferentiated human labor. So that would be the only thing that I would add there is the status of the worker or the status of labor and labor power shifts at a certain determinate point in history, right?
And this is kind of quick and dirty, but I think Marx's wager, right, is that all the latent content will be manifest, right? Because if labor can become self-conscious of its own preeminent role in production, if it could only logically take the reins of its own exploitation, let's say, or something like that, if labor can become conscious of itself as the motor of history, then it can direct its production towards use, right? But I think, the picture gets complicated because I think what that sort of implies is this is being very provisional, but I think it almost implies no further unconscious, no repression. Repression is, at least for Freud, like that is what enables society. That is what enables repression is the social relation. And maybe that's a con too. So how does one have a social relation that doesn't repress in a way?
Readers of Anti-Oedipus will key in on the way in which Deleuze and Guattari will not only historicize the rise of repression in the psychoanalytic sense of refoulement, that's the French word for it, right? But repression in the other sense, which shares a cognate in French, same word, repression. They will track the rise of psychical repression and social repression as part of one and the same history of desire, just different regimes. Hopefully that made sense the way I'm saying it.
Yeah.
Right? We in English have one word, or we might have other words, like we might sometimes slip into notions of oppression or things like this, but repression in the double sense of a political, social form of repression, and then the psychical repression that has its own interrelated history.
I brought this up a few times in the past, but Baudrillard has this very provocative claim that the quote unquote primitives did not have an unconscious. It kind of jives with what I think Deleuze and Guattari would sort of agree in a certain sense, maybe not entirely, but they do want to historicize Oedipus, for example. And in terms of the marking of bodies, where the bodies carries the mark of the entrance into the social, then that mark, the pain that is extracted, is legible, right? So in a certain way, that at least that portion of production and the social relation is legible. It's not repressed, but it's like through monetary exchange, the coin becomes the mark that allows for the sacrifice to be, I don't know if it's occluded or obfuscated or what the proper word is there, but that's the theodicy element too, is that there's just this smooth operation of the market and monetary exchange that belies the violence that sustains the violent repression, perhaps, that sustains the social relation of exchange under capital. But there's certain violence always at play, even in the potlatch, right? Because the idea is to take the violent tendencies of competition and like hierarchy, right, and as a reward, but as a mechanism to alleviate accumulation, which would result in what we sort of, I think what I'm pointing to with the gradient and this expanded notion of dead labor to incorporate the general intellect, is that side of the ledger just stacks and stacks and stacks. And while living labor works, it only contributes further to the stacking of the ledger on one side. So the accumulation of dead labor and general intellect, capital relies on, it doesn't have to pay a cost to acquire the general intellect. So that's one component. And then there's the standard dead labor element that Marx really is getting to, that's a separate thing. But both are pointing towards an asymmetry of power, if that makes sense. I don't know if that draws anything of interest for you.
I mean, I would say that you're bringing up marking. There's a sense in which, for Marx, not to pun, it's the marking of an unmarking that shows human labor has become equivalent, right? He says the secret of, because he's talking about Aristotle, and this is on page 119 to 120 of the Tomba text. Marx says the secret of the expression of value, namely that all kinds of labor are equal and equivalent because, insofar as they are human labor in general, cannot be deciphered until the notion of human equality has already acquired the fixity of a popular prejudice. It's only when we enter this age where it's taken as a given that all labor is equal or all humans are equally free to sell their abstract labor power on the market as a specific commodity that produces value. It's only with that prejudice that that value or valorization becomes able to be conceptualized and revealed. It's when the worker becomes unmarked unmarked in the sense of free, the free laborer. That's when we have the ability to see the valorization process at work.
Back to our view of Orlok. Orlok is not a person who got hungry. He is hunger that wears the residues of a person. The capitalist is Orlok in a suit. The appetite that's learned to use a calendar implying the domination of time. This grounds my provocation that every exchange is an exchange towards death. Just to clarify, this is not Heideggerian. This is not existential. This is not an ontological thing. This is an exchange towards death as a historically specific operation that could potentially, theoretically at least, be stopped, right? Capital converts the indeterminate finitude of vitality into a determinate accounting of liquidated time. Death is the existential horizon here. It is the product. And so that's why this line lands harder than anything that good old Martin could ever do. Segment 3, Gemeinwesen, the wage is alibi, and the collapse of the interval. The consumed unit is the worker's whole Gemeinwesen. The wage names labor power, but capital metabolizes the worker, not the worker's product. The wage is not an inadequate payment for hours. The wage is the alibi that obscures total metabolic consumption. It points at a determinate quantum of time so you don't notice the totalization of the operation itself. What ends up getting consumed, minds, spirits, family relations, friendships, sleep time, the knowledge endogenous to the class. The wage being the fig leaf over the consumption. From pottery to the lathe to automated cell sequence is a callback to the fragment on machines compressed. At each step, the artisan's knowledge is liquidated and transferred into fixed capital and counterposed to living labor at a higher level of abstraction. The gradient ascends from the individual, trager, right, which I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but it's interesting, trajer is the Spanish word for verb for to bring. So the bearer, I think trager, Traeger. It's like the bearer of value or the bearer of labor or something like that.
And the treg is the same as in Nachträglichkeit, right? So,
interesting. Okay, nice.
So treg is bear, carry, drag. That's the word that's closely related in English is drag, but carry and bear.
Real subsumption means there are no non-exchange moments left. The interval between thinking and being extracted from has completely collapsed. Any external suggestion or causal intuition is immediately put to work. The petit mort now circulates through your shower thoughts, your conversations about what to read or watch next. Your interior monologue kind of develops its own metaphorical P&L statement, right? This is where kind of this sort of underlying pessimism becomes empirical. Capital has eaten the outside. It's metabolized the outside, so to speak, so that there is no reserve of non-exchange relation that's available to be recovered. Orlok has become ambient, so you don't get bitten on the neck by the vampire. You exhale into the appetite without noticing because it has become the air. I've used this poem from Wordsworth, "The world is too much with us in the past," but I think I'm just going to read a little excerpt here. "The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Getting and spending is the circuit. We lay waste our powers is the metabolic consumption of the Gemeinwesen, our very capacity to be moved, our responsiveness, our craft. A sordid boon is the bad bargain at the heart of the segment. We trade our vital responsiveness for the circuit and call the trade a gift." Here's where Bataille re-enters as more than a simple analogy. The Gemeinwesen is the general economy substrate of unproductive expenditure, so gift, sacred excess, or the accursed share. Capital's operation is the conversion of all of that into a restricted economy circulation. Tomba describes the final stage where even family love and friendship and intuition are brought into this restricted economy accounting. Now, here's where it gets a little bit interesting, and we get into the kind of meat of the retroactive structure, Nachtraglichkeit and Rückwirkung, the future anterior. What's the, pronounce it for me again?
Yeah, Rückwirkung.
Rückwirkung.
I'm not exactly sure how Marx uses Gemeinwesen, but Wesen as essence and Gemein, as we talked about, having to do with the social. I looked it up just to see what a layperson's definition of Gemeinwesen would be. It's the body politic. The collective body is politically organized. But when Tomba's using it, he obviously has something specific in mind with respect to Marx, because he says capital consumes the entire Gemeinwesen of the worker. I assume it's something even more general, as in the social essence of the worker, right? Because he says capital consumes the entire Gemeinwesen of the worker, including family relations, domestic work, the growth of his knowledge, and of the sphere of social relations, which might be a good gloss on Gemeinwesen, the sphere of social relations, insofar as these can be used to increase his capacity to work. So whatever essence we have for social communal bonding and relating and being together, that gets subsumed and consumed by capital, is Tomba's point, and I assume Marx's as well. Anyway, go ahead, brother.
I'm going to quote Tomba from page 140. "This quantity can vary even when the process of production is complete. The value is not in the commodity itself. Socially necessary labor time is not a property that's carried out of the factory. It's a verdict that the market delivers later on whether the production was retrospectively justified as in terms of producing value. Production is a wager. Circulation is where the wager pays out or doesn't. And that's Freud's Nachtraglichkeit 1-for-1. An event indeterminate in itself, the concrete labor, is retroactively constituted as meaningful or socially necessary by a later event, which would be the sale on the market. The trauma is between the events. The labor does not get confirmed as socially necessary. It becomes socially necessary through this retroactive operation." Let's draw from Lacan here. The market is the point de capital of the production chain, the button switch that anchors meaning from the end backward. Some commodities never get stitched. They sit in warehouses until they are written down, their production time hanging in this permanent state of indeterminacy, the chain cut without ever being closed. The proper tense of capital is the future anterior, not is productive of capital, not was, but will have been. Capital's books are written in the future anterior, and bankruptcy is the formal admission that the Nachtraglichkeit failed, that labor will not have been socially necessary. The cruelest implications are that the worker dies first. Whether the death was for value is decided later. And to draw out the horror sort of aspect of it further, it's decided by people who never actually confront the worker in a market that the worker can't access. The answer can be no. So your death can be retroactively determined to have produced nothing, socially validated as not having produced value.
This is a quote from Tomba that reiterates what you just said, and he's putting it kind of in the in Marx's term, because he says Marx emphasized many times that only the time of socially necessary labor counts as a creator of value, such that it is only through relating the intensity of labor individually performed in the production of a given commodity to the quote usual degree of intensity in that given society, unquote, that it is possible to determine quantitatively the exchange value and the surplus value contained in a given commodity. This determination is possible only ex post, after the fact, when the process of capitalist production has gone through circulation. We cannot, in fact, know beforehand the intensity and the productive power of socially necessary labor. I was just kind of glancing on that page that you pulled from a second ago, 140, that he kind of makes this as clear as possible, what you were saying.
A change in socially necessary labor time reaches backwards to revalue commodities that have already been produced, already sold, or are sitting untouched in the warehouse. The past, then, is never actually settled. That's the textual warrant for the whole retroactive reading, and not merely our gloss, but this is Marx's term, Rückwirkung, which equals moral depreciation of fixed capital. Your perfectly functioning machine is devalued overnight because a better one now exists elsewhere. That's the coercive engine that's behind what Postone refers to as the treadmill, where
yeah, that's right. Okay.
the capitalist revolutionizes not just to get ahead, but to avoid having their accumulated dead labor retroactively liquidated. Regarding Rückwirkung, this is from page 141, and I think might be citing Marx here. There is a retroactive effect on all previously existing commodities of the same class, and their value at any given time is measured by the labor socially necessary under then existing social conditions. Here's an interesting Deleuzian tie, where this is the third synthesis of time, the future as selective principle, the eternal return that selects which of the past will be retained as having been. Nachtraglichkeit for Freud, market validation for Marx, and the third synthesis for Deleuze, 3 registers but 1 retroactive structure. Capital's most basic operation, which is value determination, is itself a 3-synthesis operation. And our operator, the petit mort A, inherits the future anterior because the objet A already operates in it. The lost object was never present except as already lost. Value in the tense of will have been lost. So capital and the unconscious are not analogous, but they share the same temporal grammar. Both are retroactive constitution machines operating on living substrates through deferred validation. The identity of structure is the formal code of what I call libidinal pessimism. This is like a standpoint I've been thinking of in terms of maybe with Freud is like the OG libidinal pessimist. The immanence guardrail here is that there is no transcendent value behind price that's waiting to be recovered. The Marx verdict is not a phenomenal approximation of a noumenal value substance. It's the operation through which value comes into being. The validation is the realness. There's no court of appeal to a true value that will let you say the death produced real value, even if the market didn't validate it. So you can think like in terms of Heinrich or even John Rolfe's abstract market theory, where I wouldn't be able to necessarily articulate Heinrich so well, but I think for Rolfe, it's like there's sort of an immanence of price, and you can think of prices as sort of an intensive measure or intensive thing, but their own, like, prices are determined in the last instance too, right? So there's an immanence to price in that sense where, I mean, that points to this too, right? Where one's ability to, or the determination as far as whether one has actually produced value isn't predetermined, right? It's retroactively determined after production has already occurred, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Segment 5, synchronization and dethroning the sun. Quoting Tomba from page 135, on the 1st of July, 1913, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the Eiffel Tower sent the first hour signal to the world. Real abstraction of time is not only an analytic posit, it's an event and has an actual date. That signal kills off local heterogeneous chronoi and installs a single global measure. This is Posttone's abstract time historicized, the substance of value could not work as a global measure until the substrate homogeneous synchronous time was technologically produced as an infrastructure. The thing destroyed were the local hours calculated on the basis of the sun. For all of human history before this, time was solar. Local noon was the sun crossing the meridian. For Bataille, the sun is the paradigm of sovereign expenditure, which gives without return, which I think the sun is there's an interesting something going on there, right? Where in 1913, or the year 1913, we replaced the sun with a broadcasting tower as the source of time. Solar time was gift time. The Eiffel Tower signal imposes time. So the occur share gets metered, it gets amortized perhaps. And then if you think about this in terms of the pocket watch is like a prosthetic of the synchronization where the portable interface now conforms the body to the time of economic transactions. But go ahead, you had something?
I was just thinking about how I know it's been maybe a year and a half to 2 years when we did Deleuze's book on Kant. And if you remember, he has that preface on the 4 poetic formulas that would summarize Kant's philosophy. And he brings in the Shakespeare quote, "Time is at a joint," right? And he credits Kant with having untethered time from movement, because classically time would have been tied to the movement of, for example, like the sun or the stars or something like this, right? So something extraneous. And Kant does away with this external referencing, kind of reverses course. This is a Marxian way of carrying out something similar, right? With the Eiffel Tower as the except here, obviously, it's a different type of marking. It's not completely the same as what Deleuze is saying with respect to Kant, but there's this untethering of time and the movement of the sun was something interesting.
I think what's interesting here too is the pocket watch. It kind of mirrors the way that the Protestant Reformation changes our relationship to, not only is there a clock, there's the it's like kill the clock in your head too, right? Not just the cop. Not only is there a cop in your head that is self-regulating, there's the clock as well. So we have to kill the clock in our heads as well as the cop, which are both sort of edifices of the same relation. The pocket watch is, again, the prosthetic of synchronization, the portable interface that conforms the body to the time of economic transactions. You can extend the line without changing its structure. The smartphone, for example, completes the pocket watch from hour resolution to millisecond resolution, from time only to attention as such. We always carry our phones in our pockets. There's sort of an interesting lineage there that goes with respect to what I was describing earlier, the way that Orlok, the vampire of capital, has become ambient, where like our exhalation, our attention, everything is captured. There's no waste. There's an attempt to try to recirculate any kind of expenditure as accumulation. For example, on your phone, you could be posting on your time off, right? You post to a social media app, or you give your attention to an app, and by doing, you're generating value, maybe not value in Marx's sense, but you're giving something to the platform, right? Because it feeds on eyeballs and attention and that sort of thing. Here's where the Richard Seaford triad pays off, because we have monetary cognition universalizing across time, space, and person, the Eiffel Tower being the time axis. The average unit of universal labor is the space axis. The Traeger reduced to fungible metabolic capacity is the personal axis. Tomba gives us the mature capitalist instance of exactly what Richard Seaford located in archaic Greece, where the structural identity that bridges like 2.5 millennia there. Tomba from page 135. The destruction of the independence of local hours regulated and calculated on the basis of the sun. Now time, just like money, needed to be carried in the pocket. There's a homology present with monetary sovereignty, The polis stamps the coin. The state operates the broadcast tower. Time sovereignty and value sovereignty are the same operation in two different registers. Both are real abstractions enacted through specific material infrastructure, for example, coinage and telegraphy. Both require sovereign authority. The Eiffel Tower being a monument of the French state isn't just incidental. That's the macro scale of the porosity war. Dethroning the sun is deporosification at cosmic scale, eliminating the great pore of night. So the same operation as reducing porosity per hour at the granular scale. So this is segment 6, the foreclosed dead, which is really the climax of the episode here. And this is a quote from Tomba on page 127. Expropriated from workers, incorporated into fixed capital, and counterposed to workers. So this kind of follows their trajectory of pottery to lathe to automatic machine. Capital uses calculus, the alphabet, metallurgy, double entry bookkeeping, the entire accumulated general intellect of the species for free. Newton isn't paid a licensing fee. The Sumerians don't get a royalty. This is dead labor in my expanded sense, where congealed past human activity that is not constant capital. It was never purchased, it has no price, and it transfers no measured value. The question is why it rides free. The value form can only price living labor in a present exchange, and the general intellect has no living bearer who can be paid, because the dead cannot sell. So it rides free, not because capital cleverly steals it, but because the value form structurally can't price it. That's the economic correlate to the Baudrillardian foreclosure of the dead, where like the dead don't have any exchange value, or death has no exchange equivalent. Political economy abolishes symbolic exchange with the dead. The free ride on the commons, that is that foreclosure seen from the side of accumulation. The titan to ontology here is that general intellect is labor, is congealed lifetime, dead labor in the literal sense that it was once living expenditure and now persists in an objectified manner. But it is dead labor that is all use value and no value. So it's maximally productive and totally unpriced. It contributes real productivity. So the pencil gets made while registering zero value, so no price. That's why it's both essential and invisible. Capital's accounting only sees value, and this is the productive substrate with none. The weaponization here, the dark turn. The dead labor of the species arrives in the present already captured and congealed into the privately owned means of production. The worker now confronts the accumulated dead labor of all human history, not as inheritance, but as capital's private weapon, standing over against her as an alien power. This is, in the deepest sense, the dead dominate the living. So the worker begins by bargaining across the table in which capital has already placed the congealed lifetimes of 10,000 years, right? Versus the individual laborer only has their single living body. And this asymmetry is not between worker and boss, it's between the living present and the captured dead. Primitive accumulation of the dead. The deepest, most continuous primitive accumulation is the enclosure of the dead. And it deepens every cycle because every generation's living labor congeals into new dead labor captured on capital's side. And so that is a big aspect of what I refer to as sort of the gradient. It's this accumulation of all human activity that only grows higher while the individual laborer's power and capacity is diminished, not only in terms of what one can produce, but in terms of how one can reproduce oneself. Our ability to reproduce ourselves is increasingly diminished, while the accumulation of capital and this sort of free rider, in addition to the dead labor, as Marx theorizes it, it's like this compounding level of domination. Contemporary intellectual property and patent enclosure of intellectual commons is this reaching its most explicit phase. Newton still doesn't get paid, but now you pay to use what Newton gave freely. Reading from page 145.
The computer requires the sweatshop, and the existence of the cyborg is based on the slave. The imminent reductio. Take capital's own pricing, logic, which is price your inputs, the margin is your profit. On that logic, profit could not exist if the largest input were priced. The margin is only positive because the unpriced input, the general intellect, is set to zero or valued at zero. So profit is the monetized free ride on the dead. So this is kind of similar, I think, to Federici talking about how reproductive labor and sort of household labor that is performed by women is appropriated. Capital cheats its own accounting principle. It prices what has living sellers and takes for free what has only dead sellers. The smoking gun being this opportunistic reclassification. Capital treats the general intellect as a free gift of nature when it is writing it. It treats the same general intellect as priceable private property, so intellectual property and patents, when it has the ability to enclose it. So it's free when capital benefits from the freeness and valuable when capital can charge. And the classification is strategic and not principal, drawn wherever appropriation is maximized. The contradiction is the thing that the Odyssey exists to conceal. The sordid boon, or why the gift of the dead is the only true gift, drawing on Derrida. Derrida, in Given Time, a true gift is impossible the moment it enters any cycle of return. The instant a gift is recognized as a gift, it summons gratitude, obligation, reciprocity, and so cancels itself and becomes exchange. A pure gift would have to fall outside all return, unrecognized, unreciprocated, and unrepayable. Now let's look at the dead here. The dead can receive nothing back. Newton, the Sumerians, the ancestors are structurally incapable of being repaid, thanked, or drawn into any circle of return. So the general intellect is the one gift that actually satisfies Derrida's impossible condition. It is the only pure gift because no counter movement to it is possible. They do not receive anything back. Here is the cruelty, and it's very exact. The very feature that makes it a pure gift, no return is possible, is the feature that makes it pure appropriation. No payment is owed. Purity and exploitation are the same property seen from two sides. And that's where Wordsworth's sordid boon takes on its darkest character. In segment 3, the sordid boon was our own bad bargain. Here it is the dead's gift, the only ungrudging, unrepayable giving there is, and precisely therefore the thing capital takes for nothing. So you can fold in the genealogy from Baudrillard here, where first the symbolic debt to the dead is canceled, Baudrillard's expulsion of the dead from exchange. Once the dead is canceled, the dead's gifts returns nothing, Derrida's pure gift. Because it returns nothing, capital writes it free. The value form cannot price what has no living bearer. One foreclosure, 3 thinkers, the dead were made unpriceable before they were made free, and the same gesture did both. So the 3 temporal regimes of dead labor and why math is the limit case and not the exception. Dead labor doesn't have one temporal character. Let's look at a few different regimes here. One being the physical machine. It is in time and bound by it. It rusts, obsolesces, gets morally depreciated by a Rückwirkung, gets superseded by a better machine, half use value, half value, the muddy case, the mixed case. Regime 2, the embodied skill or technique. It dies as value the moment it's transmitted or made common. That's the deskilling of the worker. Its value collapses by being spread and not by aging. Regime 3, formal mathematical content. The calculus, the theorem, the algorithm, it never degrades as use. A valid proof is not on a productivity curve. There is no better theorem that morally depreciates it. Its value as labor drops to zero the instant it is universal, while its use value is permanent and total. So math is not a counterexample to dead labor that is all use value and no value. It's the limit case of it. The machine is the muddy instance. The theorem is the clean one where there's permanent use, zero price, no seller, and no expiration date. This makes the free ride more total for math, not less, because capital at least had to buy the machine as constant capital. The theorem it never bought and can never buy because there's no unit to purchase and no one to purchase it from, and it never wears out. So Newton's calculus is more perfectly free-ridden than any machine ever could be. Don't say capital wrongs the dead or that the dead are owed or unpaid. The deceased are beyond time and beyond claimed. They cannot be wronged. Their timelessness is not the obstacle to the thesis, it is the precondition of the appropriation. Their expulsion from time severs the debt. The labor's persistence keeps it usable. And capital lives at the seam between the timeless person and the usable residue. The injustice, if you want to keep that register at all, is intergenerational and done to the living. They face the captured dead as an alien weapon, and they are themselves converted into the next stratum of timeless dead whose labor stays behind. There's an interesting way to really look at this. This is what to me was the most fascinating implication. Looking at first the calculator, then the computer, and then the AI service in this kind of context. This is where things can kind of become concrete for our audience. There's three escalating cases, where the first being the calculator, which is the most clean. Its algorithms, which would be things like square roots, trigonometry, the series expansions, are regime 3 content. So timeless, unpriceable, and free. Newton isn't paid, but the device itself is regime 1. It's a physical shell, bought once, and it depreciates. So you pay for the shell, and the shell's price is the only thing that would be recorded in any ledger. And the whole intellectual inheritance writing inside it is made invisible by being bundled with the one component that actually does have a price. You think you bought a calculation, but you bought a piece of plastic that delivers 2,000 years of dead mathematical labor for free, and the price tag is the alibi, the pencil structure, but one tier higher. The computer generalizes this to like an absolute vertigo. It's the universal container for arbitrary regime 3 content. Every algorithm, method, and data structure ever devised running at zero marginal cost and zero payment to its origin. A single running program braids all three regimes at once. Hardware is regime 1, where Moore's law of moral depreciation operates in its purest form. So your machine is worthless in 3 years, not because it broke, but because a better one exists. The algorithm is regime 3, so a theorem that's unpriceable. The particular code base, regime 2, the programmers were waged, their congealed skill counterposed to the next programmers as the legacy system must remain, so de-skilling in real time. Capitalism sells you the braid and pays only the thinnest strand, which is the living programmer's wage, and it rides on top of the other two for free. The computer is also the perfected synchronizer. Machine time has no pore, no interval, no recovery, and no drift. It is poreless time as such, and living labor set to its pace. So, for example, the warehouse scanner, the click rate, those are the maximally deporosified worker. A tempo with no day and no night, which is going to be, if we reach it, segment 8's indifference between day and night, given a literal clock. Here's where it gets most complete in terms of the AI service, which is the regime 3 appropriation. And that is like the raw material of general intellect itself directly. Not one technique, but the accumulated linguistic and intellectual output of the species, scraped, congealed, and sold back as a service. And this is primitive accumulation of the dead in its most literal form, where the training corpus is the foreclosed dead at an industrial scale. The writing of the living and the dead alike, most of it uncompensated, much of it by people who are now dead who can receive nothing back, metabolized into a model whose outputs are priced, while its inputs are taken for free. The dead made to speak in a fluent present tense voice, in a frame owned by capital, returning nothing to those whose words compose the voice. Urlach learned to talk. Now there's 2 caveats. First, this is not the serene unpriceability of a theorem. A theorem has no unit and no seller. A training corpus is made of works that often did have living bearers who could have been paid. So things like lawsuits and licensing deals are an attempt to reprice what was already taken as free. This free ride is not a structural inevitability like math. It is an enclosure in progress, though, whose boundary is being fought over right now in like the courts. It maps the opportunistic reclassification point exactly, though. Treated as free gift of nature when training, as priceable private property when selling the outputs, and the seam is live and visible. So second, don't let the framework prejudge what the machine is. The strong thesis wants the model to be pure congealed dead labor, the maximal automaton, and that's largely defensible, and the present tense compute is real living energy animating dead weights, so the vampire line read literally. But whether that happens in a model is only the replay of the congealed past, or whether something present tense exceeds the corpus is genuinely open. The clean answer, which would be just dead labor talking, is seductive in exactly the way the whole episode teaches you to distrust, because it's the answer that makes the theory total. So we want to pose a question and not close it. Calibrating the originality claim. The seed, capital free rides on the inherited commons, is not unsaid. Thinking of Kropotkin in The Conquest of Bread, the inherited collective labor as common patrimony, Thorsten Veblen in terms of common stock of knowledge, Herbert Simon in terms of inherited social capital as patrimony, justifying high taxation. You also have the cognitive capitalism school, which is like Versalone, Moulier, Boutang, Marazzi, and they talk about the appropriation of general intellect. Other people did bring this up, so I don't want to necessarily like stake that I'm the first person or we're the first person to like draw this out. Capital's profit comes not from exclusive access, but from the private capture of the surplus the freely available commons makes possible. That capture works because capital owns the apparatus through which the commons is set to work and owns the product. The freed commons is not capital's exclusive input. Capital's private enclosure of the fruits is the theft. Segment 7, the theodicy, money as the operator of concealment. And I'm going to read Tomba from page 186. The dull compulsion of economic relations completes the subjection of the laborer to the capitalist. Money does not represent time. Money and abstract time are co-products of a single operation of flattening. That flattening renders things commensurable. It destroys qualitative heterogeny, so living durations, concrete labors, into a quantitative homogeny. Money and time are not in a representation relation. They're a homology of genesis, one flattening that's seen twice. Abstract labor time is the hinge term where their identity shows. So for Postone, abstract time is the substance of value, not a thing that money stands for. This flattening is the elision. By rendering lifetime as homogeneous commensurable units, the flattening makes the wage look like an equal exchange. This is why exploitation occurs without violating the law of equivalence. In the regime of equivalence, there can be no exploitation by definition. And that is the theodicy, the demonstration that the order is fair, voluntary, harmonious, and it is achieved by flattening the unmeasurable sacrifice into measurable equivalence. Marx's fetishism equals the sacrifice thesis. Relations between persons assume the form of relations between things. The hidden relation as a thing relation is at bottom the sacrificial relation, the collective consumption of lifetime. Metabolic lifetime moves to rendered as abstract labor, moves to appearing as money. 3 levels, not synonyms. Abstract labor is lifetime already subjected to the measure. Money elides the sacrifice by showing the measured and conceals the unmeasured. My provocation that all societies are primitive. Modernity has not transcended the sacrificial. It has congealed it behind money while remaining as sacrificial as any society that most described. The primitive sacrificed in the open and knew what they were doing. We sacrifice more life than any society before us while seeing it less. The spectral primal father Noah admits to having killed. The resonance with Girard is where Girard sees modernity progressively unconcealing the founding violence. Capitalism develops a new, more total concealment, money, which reveals what was almost revealed. To return back to the pencil, I pencil is Leibnizian theodicy in economic form. Windowless monads, each producer knowing only its tiny part, harmonized by a coordinating medium that none of them perceives. That medium, the price, the invisible hand, is pre-established harmony with the planner God, rendered spectral. The conclusion, all is well and no exploitation takes place. The price signal that Friedman marvels at is abstract labor time and its necessary form of appearance, money, the communicable face of this flattening. The pencil is cheap because the sacrifice of both the living and the dead is total, and the concealment is total. So I pencil is the catechism of a theodicy whose celebrants experience the concealment of violence as a religious wonder, as a miracle, right? Like I think Friedman literally remarks on it as a miracle that this coordination can occur, right? This is going to be Tomba from page 153. There is no wage that could pay for the consumption of the life and the body of the worker. This is the
and
same.
That's Achilles, right? I mean,
Precisely.
That's Achilles made modern in terms of capitalist Achilles or anti-capitalist Achilles. Anyway, sorry.
Back to the Achilles that we drew on in the opening, the life is inexchangeable. No catalog of goods touches it, and the structure is identical. Agency has drained out across the arc, though. Achilles names the inexchangeable and is able to withdraw. He takes his lifetime off the field because there's still an outside to withdraw to. The worker names the same truth and has no ability to act on it because equivalence has closed over everything and there's no field to leave. That draining is the whole episode in one comparison, right? The Iliad refusal and the no wage line are the two ends of what happens when happens to the inexchangeable once the apeiron is unbound. You cannot have it. It is beyond your goods to, it has no price. Therefore, I take it for nothing. The silent coercion correction. What would this be? Stumers Wong is the concealment.
Yeah, I'm looking for the word in your, Summers Wong. Is that the dumb?
So that's the concealment operator.
That's the dull, whatever. What was that quote? The dull compulsion. There you go.
Gotcha. In the ordinary course, no visible violence is needed. Coercion is silent, naturalized through education, tradition, and habit. Silent is not absent, it's present but unheard. Adjustment 1 here. The sacrifice is the silence violence inside the ordinary wage relation, not the exceptional extra economic violence. The deepest concealment is of the everyday silent sacrifice. The state's direct violence is the unsilenced exceptional remainder. The most concealed violence is the quiet one, not the spectacular one. Adjustment 2. The silence is ordinary, but not total. For Tomba here, direct violence erupts in exactly 2 cases. One is when living labor derails from the tracks, so resistance. And the second is when new masses must be synchronized. So that would be something along the lines of new enclosure. The theodicy is continuously maintained, and its maintenance requires periodic eruptions of unsilenced Gewalt at the edges. This is where the potlatch war breaks through the Leibnizian harmony. The agonistic sacrificial truth money hides, surfacing in the creditor-debtor war and in crisis. You don't want to let the concealment become total or you erase the counter tendency. That might be a good stopping place. Do you have anything you want to contribute?
This is a good rundown of some of the salient points, and I liked you going back through and touching on some of the things we've discussed in the past in our episodes. I won't repeat all that you've said here, but I do think this question of the concealment, and I guess I have a question about this last point, one of the last points you made. You were talking about the silence is ordinary but not total. Is that something you're getting from Tomba, where he's kind of warning us about how it's an illusion of capital that we would think of it as total? It's a way of eternalizing exchange value, is one of the ways he puts it. Is that part of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I think so. But I think also just in terms of my theoretical apparatus I think a hesitancy to arrive at a totalizing theoretical point, maintain some space for like the ability to, I guess, to not foreclose everything totally, but certainly to like honestly and viciously examine the state of things too. But I think just to ultimately resist complete totalization, if that helps. But I think, yeah, it's kind of both.
I think that's a good point.
I have a handful of bullet points that I want to recapitulate just to put a button on the episode. The first is Orlok is capital seen from the inside of its drive, pure appetite, indifferent to quality, responding only to intensity, and structurally unable to register a limit. I pencil is capital seen from inside its self-justification, the harmony, the wonder, and the providential coordination. They are the same object. The appetite is what the harmony conceals. The harmony is how the appetite continues unseen. Tomba's lasting gift to us is capital is not capital's autobiography. It's the record of the clash, and that's between a tendency and a counter tendency. The tendency is measureless, metabolic, retroactive, and total in tendency. It only ever exists in friction with the durations that refuse to be metabolized. And then, this is mine. All societies are primitive. We're only the most mystified and the most consuming. The poor is where we are still barely alive. Unless you have something to add, we can wrap up this week's edition of the Machine of Unconscious Happy Hour.
Of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious character. To the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.